The fluorescent lights of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport hummed with the kind of sterile indifference that makes 3 in the morning feel like the loneliest hour on earth. Patricia Bellworth stood at gate C-47, her reflection a ghost in the rain-streaked windows. Beyond the glass, the tarmac stretched black and wet, punctuated by the blinking lights of aircraft taxiing through the darkness. She was 56 years old, dressed in a charcoal wool coat that cost more than some people's monthly rent, and she had not slept properly in 3 years. Not since Michael. She checked her phone again. No messages, no missed calls. Just the time glowing back at her, 3:47 a.m., and the background photo she could not bring herself to change. Michael in his dress blues the day he came home from his third deployment. His smile wide and genuine, his eyes already carrying shadows she had refused to see. The boarding announcement crackled through the terminal speakers, distant and distorted like a voice calling from underwater. Air Atlantic Flight 447 to Reykjavik. Now boarding all passengers. Trish gathered her carry-on and her neck pillow, the latter a badge of experience that marked her as someone who had learned to sleep in hostile environments. Business trips, red eyes, hotel rooms that all looked the same no matter which city she woke up in. Sleep, however, was not what she expected on this flight. She moved through the jet bridge with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had long ago learned that hesitation was a luxury she could not afford. 47 properties under her management and across the Pacific Northwest. A real estate empire built from nothing after Michael's death, constructed brick by brick from the rubble of a life she had not asked to rebuild. Row 8 was near the front of the aircraft, business class adjacent, close enough to the cockpit to hear the pilots talking if they spoke loud enough, far enough back that she could pretend she was anonymous. She found her seat 8B and stopped. The man in 8A was already there. He sat against the window with his eyes closed, though she could not tell if he was sleeping or simply unwilling to engage with the world. His head rested against the curved wall of the fuselage, tilted at an angle that suggested exhaustion rather than comfort. A leather jacket hung over his shoulders like armor cracked and worn in the way that spoke of years rather than fashion. His arms were crossed over his chest, and even in the dim cabin lighting, she could see the ink. Tattoos crawled up both forearms, disappearing beneath rolled sleeves. Some looked military eagles and flags and coordinates she did not recognize. Others looked like something else entirely. A skull with wings, a number 81 that meant nothing to her, but clearly meant something to him. And on his right hand, catching the overhead light, as his fingers twitched in whatever dream or memory held him, a ring. Heavy silver, a death's head with wings spread wide. Hell's Angels. Trish felt her spine stiffen. She knew that symbol. She had seen it before in photographs Michael kept in a shoebox under their bed. In the faces of men who came to his funeral wearing leather instead of suits. Their motorcycles rumbling outside the church like distant thunder. Men who had promised to look out for him. Men who had failed. She stood there for a moment too long, blocking the aisle as other passengers shuffled past. An older woman with a rolling bag. A young couple holding hands. A businessman already buried in his phone. The man in 8A did not open his eyes. Trish sat down in 8B, moving with the careful precision of someone handling something volatile. She placed her purse in the empty seat beside her 8C and felt a small measure of relief at the barrier it created. 3 seats in the row, him at the window, her in the middle, her bag claiming the aisle. A wall, however small. She fastened her seatbelt with more force than necessary and stared straight ahead at the seat back in front of her, at the safety card tucked into its pocket, at the tiny screen that would soon offer movies and maps and the illusion of connection. She did not look at him again, but she could feel him there, a presence that occupied space in a way that made the cabin feel smaller. The smell of leather and motor oil faint but unmistakable. The sound of his breathing slow and deep, the rhythm of someone who had learned to rest whenever the opportunity presented itself. Like Michael used to. The thought arrived uninvited, and she pushed it away with the same practiced violence she applied to all memories of her husband. 3 years of practice had made her efficient at this. 3 years of waking alone in a bed too large for one person. 3 years of avoiding the veterans organizations that sent letters, the support groups that promised healing, the well-meaning friends who suggested she might find comfort in connecting with others who understood. She did not want to understand. She wanted to forget. The cabin filled steadily around her. Overhead bins clicked shut with the percussive rhythm of departure. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, their smiles professional and automatic, their eyes scanning for problems that had not yet manifested. The engines began their low hum, building towards something larger. Trish pulled out her phone one last time before the announcement came to power down all devices. She scrolled through emails. She had already read messages. She had already answered anything to keep her eyes occupied and her attention focused on something other than the man beside her. A text from her assistant confirming tomorrow's meeting in Reykjavik. A property developer interested in her firm's international expansion. Big money, the kind of deal that would have made Michael proud back when such things mattered to her for reasons beyond the numbers. She typed a quick reply, her thumbs moving with practiced speed, and then powered down the phone as instructed. The safety demonstration began. Trish watched without watching, the gestures, so familiar they had lost all meaning. Seatbelts click like this. Oxygen masks fall from above. In the event of a water landing, which everyone knew meant a crash, your seat cushion becomes a flotation device. The man in 8A did not move. His eyes remained closed throughout the demonstration, his breathing unchanged, his body motionless except for the slight rise and fall of his chest beneath the leather jacket. Either he had seen this performance 100 times before, or he simply did not care. Trish decided it was arrogance, the kind of dismissive confidence that came from believing the rules did not apply to you. The kind she had seen in Michael's friends, the ones who rode too fast and drank too hard and promised each other they would be there when it mattered. They had not been there when it mattered. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, and Trish felt the familiar lurch of movement, the subtle shift in gravity that marked the beginning of every journey. Outside the window beyond the man she refused to acknowledge, the airport lights slid past like fireflies trapped behind glass. She closed her own eyes and tried to will herself towards sleep. It would not come. 3 rows back in seat 11C, a man named Douglas Keller sat with his hands folded in his lap and his spine perfectly straight despite the cramped quarters. He was 68 years old, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of posture that decades of military service had burned into his bones. Even now, 5 years retired from the United States Army, he could not bring himself to slouch. Dutch, his men had called him. Sergeant Major Dutch Keller. 32 years of service. 4 wars, more deployments than he could count without consulting the records he kept in a fireproof safe in his basement. He was flying to Iceland to visit his daughter, who had married a fisherman and moved to a village whose name Dutch still could not pronounce correctly. His wife had died 2 years ago, and his daughter worried about him being alone. This trip was her idea, a week together in a rented cottage by the sea, far from everything that reminded him of the life he had built and the woman he had shared it with. Dutch did not mind the reminder. He carried Eleanor with him everywhere, in the wedding ring he still wore, and the photographs in his wallet, and the empty space beside him in every room he entered. But his daughter needed to see him, and he needed to see her, and so he had boarded this red-eye flight with a carry-on bag and a paperback novel he had no intention of reading. He had noticed the man in 8A the moment he boarded. Not consciously, not at first. It was the kind of awareness that 32 years of combat had instilled in him, a constant low-level scanning of environments and faces and body language that happened without thought. Threat assessment, pattern recognition, the difference between someone who was dangerous and someone who was merely capable of danger. The man in 8A was both. Dutch had seen the tattoos, the ring, the way he carried himself even in sleep. He had seen the leather jacket with its patches and pins, the marks of a life lived on the margins of society. And he had seen something else, something that most civilians would miss entirely. The way the man held himself still. The economy of movement, every gesture purposeful, nothing wasted. The face that looked relaxed but was actually carefully neutral, a mask worn so long it had become indistinguishable from the truth. This was a man who had been trained. This was a man who had seen combat. Dutch filed the observation away and settled into his seat, watching the cabin fill around him with the patient attention of someone who had learned that waiting was its own form of action. The aircraft reached the runway and paused, engines building toward their crescendo. Trish gripped her armrests as the plane began its acceleration, the G-forces pressing her back into her seat with the familiar weight of departure. Outside, the runway lights became a blur, a tunnel of illumination that ended in darkness and ski. Then the nose lifted and they were airborne. Seattle fell away beneath them, a grid of lights giving way to the black expanse of Puget Sound. The aircraft banked gently northward, climbing toward cruising altitude, climbing toward the polar route that would carry them over Canada and Greenland and the North Atlantic. Trish stared at her reflection in the darkened window superimposed over the void beyond. She looked tired. She looked older than 56, though everyone told her she did not. She looked like a woman who had built walls so high she could no longer see over them. The seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft chime, and the cabin settled into the rhythms of flight. Passengers adjusted pillows and blankets. Screens flickered to life with movies and maps. The flight attendants began their service, moving through the aisles with carts and practiced smiles. Trish declined everything: water, wine, the meal service that would come later. She wanted nothing except the solitude of her own thoughts and the 6 hours of flight time that separated her from the next phase of her carefully constructed life. She pulled out a folder from her bag and began reviewing documents for tomorrow's meeting. Property values, market analyses, the dry language of commerce that had become her refuge. The man in 8A slept on. Somewhere over British Columbia, Trish's eyes began to grow heavy. The documents blurred before her, numbers, losing meaning, sentences, fragmenting into nonsense. She fought it for a while, the stubborn resistance of someone who distrusted vulnerability, but eventually her body won the argument her mind refused to concede. She slept, and in her sleep, she dreamed of Michael. He stood in their kitchen, the one in the house they had shared for 18 years, wearing the faded flannel shirt he always wore on Sunday mornings. Sunlight streamed through the window above the sink, catching dust motes that floated like tiny stars. He was making coffee, the old percolator he refused to replace, despite her complaints about efficiency and time. She tried to speak to him, but her voice would not come. She tried to reach for him, but her arms would not move. He turned to look at her, and his face was wrong. Not injured, not decayed, but simply absent. A blank space where his features should have been smooth and featureless as a mannequin. She woke with a small gasp, her heart pounding against her ribs, like something trying to escape. The cabin was darker now. Most of the overhead lights had been dimmed, and the other passengers had settled into various states of sleep and quiet occupation. The engines hummed their constant note, a sound so steady it became its own form of silence. Trish checked her watch. 3 hours into the flight, halfway to Iceland. She glanced to her left toward the window seat and found the man in 8A watching her. His eyes were open, dark, and steady, fixed on her with an attention that made her skin prickle. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. Then he looked away, returning his gaze to the window and the darkness beyond, and the moment broke like glass. Trish's breath came faster than it should. She told herself it was the dream, the residue of nightmare still clinging to her nervous system. She told herself it was nothing, a stranger glancing at a stranger, meaningless in the grand scheme of an anonymous flight. But something had shifted in that look. Something had passed between them that she could not name. She did not sleep again. The man in 8A was named Garrett Cole, and he had been awake for most of the flight. Not entirely awake. He had drifted in and out of the shallow sleep that years of military service and parenthood had trained him to survive, on the kind of rest that refreshed the body without ever fully releasing the mind. Alert even in unconsciousness, ready to move at the first sign of trouble. It was a habit he had never been able to break, not even 5 years after leaving the cockpit of an F-16 for the last time. He was 38 years old, though most people guessed younger. Something about the way he moved maybe, or the fact that his face had not yet learned to show everything it carried. His hair was dark, cut short, in a style that was neither military nor civilian, something in between. His eyes were the color of coffee without cream, and they missed very little. He had noticed the woman in 8B the moment she sat down. Not because she was beautiful, though she was in the severe way of women who had learned to make themselves hard. Not because she was interesting, though something about the set of her jaw and the tension in her shoulders suggested depths she worked hard to hide. He had noticed her because of the way she looked at him. That quick assessment, that immediate judgment, the subtle repositioning of her body angling away, creating distance. The purse placed deliberately in the empty seat like a barricade against contamination. Garrett knew that look. He had seen it 1,000 times before, in 1,000 different faces. The moment when a stranger registered the leather, the tattoos, the ring, and decided they knew everything they needed to know about him. He did not blame them. The Hells Angels had earned their reputation through decades of behavior that ranged from criminal to violent to simply frightening. The 81 on his forearm, the death's head on his ring, these symbols carried weight that no individual could fully counterbalance. But Garrett's chapter was different, had always been different. They did the work that no one else would do, the rescues that could not wait for official channels, the interventions that required men who were willing to step outside the law when the law was too slow or too blind or too corrupt to protect those who needed protection. 3 nights ago, he had helped a mother and her 2 children escape a man who had put her in the hospital twice. The police had done nothing. The courts had done nothing. The system had failed her so completely that she had stopped believing anyone would help. Garrett and his brothers had arrived at 2 in the morning with 3 trucks and a plan. By dawn, the woman and her children were in a safe house 400 miles away with new phones and emergency funds and the number of a lawyer who specialized in making abusers very, very sorry. That was the work. That was what the ring meant. That was what the leather represented, at least for the men Garrett rode with. But the woman in 8B did not know any of that. She saw what everyone saw, and she made the same assumptions everyone made, and Garrett had long ago stopped trying to correct those assumptions. He closed his eyes and let the engine's hum carry him towards something that might have been sleep. And he thought about Lily. His daughter was 9 years old, and she was the reason he had walked away from the only career he had ever wanted. She was the reason he had traded the cockpit of a fighter jet for the seat of a Harley. She was the reason he measured his life now in school plays, in homework sessions, in Saturday morning pancakes instead of deployment rotations and combat hours. She was everything. Everything. Her mother had left when Lily was 2. No warning, no explanation. Just a note on the kitchen table and an empty closet where half their life had hung the day before. Garrett had come home from a training exercise to find his daughter crying in his sister's arms and his marriage reduced to a single sheet of paper. I can't do this anymore. That was all. 4 words that erased 4 years. For a while, he had tried to make it work. The deployments and the single fatherhood, the long absences, and the longer nights of guilt. His sister Rosemary had stepped in, taking care of Lily whenever duty called, being the constant presence that Garrett could not be. But children do not count their parents' reasons. They only count the absences. He remembered the moment that changed everything. Coming home from his 3rd deployment in 4 years, walking into Rosemary's house with arms full of presents and a smile that felt like a mask. Lily had been 4 years old and she had looked at him with the cautious eyes of a child meeting a stranger. She had turned to Rosemary and asked in a voice that would haunt him forever, "Who are you?" Not who is he, not where's my daddy. Who are you? As if she had forgotten him. As if he had been gone so long that she no longer recognized the man who was supposed to be the center of her world. That night after Lily was asleep, Garrett had sat in Rosemary's kitchen and made a decision. He submitted his separation papers the next morning, walked away from 1,200 hours of flight time, 3 deployments, 2 commendations for valor. Walked away from the skiing and everything it meant to him. For Lily, I will always come home, sweetheart. That is a promise. He had kept that promise for 5 years. Every night, no matter what. Every morning, no matter how tired. Every pancake perfectly golden, every bedtime story read to the end, every scraped knee kissed better, and every nightmare chased away. He had built a new life out of the ruins of the old one. Found the Hell's Angels, or maybe they had found him. Discovered that brotherhood did not require a uniform, and that protecting the innocent did not require a cockpit. But the sky still called to him sometimes. In dreams usually. The feeling of the stack in his hand responsive and alive. The G-forces pressing him into his seat as he pulled through a turn. The horizon rolling earth and sky, trading places, the world reduced to pure physics and perfect control. He missed it the way an amputee misses a phantom limb. But he had made his choice and he did not regret it. Lily was worth any sacrifice. She was worth 1,000 careers, 1,000 skies. This trip to Iceland was supposed to be simple. 3 days consulting for a tech firm, clean work, well paid. He would be home before Lily had time to miss him. Home before the routines that held their life together had to bend too far. He checked his phone one more time before they had lost signal over the ocean. A message from Rosemary. She's asleep. Flight leaves on time. He had typed back. Boarding now, home by noon, pancakes. The reply had come almost instantly. She's already planning the menu, blueberries this time. The corner of his mouth had lifted. Such a small thing. Such a precious small thing. Now, 3 hours into the flight, suspended somewhere over the North Atlantic, in the eternal darkness of a polar crossing, Garrett drifted between waking and sleeping and tried not to think about how far he was from everything that mattered. He felt the woman in 8B watching him sometimes. Quick glances, barely more than flickers. The way you watch something you do not trust, checking to make sure it has not moved closer while your attention was elsewhere. He understood. He did not like it, but he understood. And then around 2 hours before they were scheduled to land, everything changed. It started with turbulence, not the gentle rocking that passengers had grown accustomed to over the hours of flight, but something sharper. A sudden drop that made stomachs lurch and drinks spill, and sleeping passengers jolt awake with gasps of alarm. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a harsh chime. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain's voice announced, "We are experiencing some rough air. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Routine, normal. The kind of announcement that happened on every flight and meant nothing beyond temporary inconvenience. But something in the captain's voice was off. A tightness that most passengers would miss entirely. A hesitation between words that suggested he was speaking while simultaneously dealing with something else. Garrett heard it immediately. His eyes opened fully, his body shifting from rest to alert in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He scanned the cabin automatically, cataloging faces and reactions. Fear, confusion, annoyance. The woman in 8B had gone pale, her hands gripping the armrest with white-knuckled intensity. The aircraft shuddered again. Harder this time. Something groaned in the walls, a sound that did not belong to turbulence. Garrett's attention shifted to the ceiling, to the overhead compartments, to the subtle vibrations that traveled through the airframe like messages in a language only pilots understood. Something was wrong, something beyond rough air. He waited. 3 rows back, Sergeant Major Dutch Keller had reached the same conclusion. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded, his breathing controlled, but his eyes were moving. Reading the cabin the way he had once read battlefields, looking for information, for patterns, for the truth beneath the surface. The turbulence intensified. The aircraft pitched and rolled, each movement more violent than the last. Overhead bins rattled. A child began to cry somewhere in the back. Voices rose in confusion and fear. And then the captain's voice returned, and everything Dutch had suspected crystallized into certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hendricks." The words were measured, careful, but the strain beneath them was unmistakable now. This was not a routine announcement. This was a man fighting to maintain control while the situation around him deteriorated. "I need to ask if there are any military pilots on board this aircraft. If so, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately." The cabin went silent, not the comfortable silence of sleep or distraction, but the brittle silence of collective fear. The kind of silence that happens when everyone simultaneously realizes that something is very, very wrong. Trish felt her heart stop. She had flown hundreds of times, business trips and family vacations, and the endless shuffling between cities that her work required. She had experienced turbulence and delays and the occasional scary landing. But she had never heard anything like this. Pilots do not ask for other pilots unless something has failed catastrophically. She looked around the cabin, searching for reassurance and finding none. Faces frozen in various stages of shock, hands reaching for other hands. A mother pulling her child closer, shielding him with her body from a threat that had no visible form. And beside her in seat 8A, the man in the leather jacket had gone completely still. Not the stillness of sleep, the stillness of a predator deciding whether to act. His eyes were open now, fixed on the seat back in front of him, but she could tell he was not really seeing it. He was listening, processing, calculating. The flight attendant appeared in the aisle, moving faster than professionalism normally allowed. Her eyes swept the rows, searching for something specific, her voice low and urgent as she leaned toward passengers. "Excuse me, are you a pilot? Any aviation experience?" Shaking heads, confused murmurs, nothing. She passed them without stopping, continuing toward the back of the aircraft, her search growing more desperate with each empty response. Trish turned to look at the man beside her. She did not know why she did it. Instinct, maybe. The same instinct that had made her notice the way he reacted to the announcement, the way his breathing changed, the way his body tensed. He was staring at the window now at his own reflection overlaid on the darkness beyond. And in that reflection, she saw something that made her breath catch. He was afraid. Not panicked, not hysterical, but afraid in the deep, quiet way of someone who understood exactly what was happening and exactly what it might cost. She knew that look. She had seen it in Michael's eyes in the months before the end, when he stopped telling her about his nightmares and started building walls she could not climb. The aircraft shuddered again, harder. A voice came from 3 rows back, loud enough to cut through the whispers and the fear, authoritative in a way that commanded attention without demanding it. "You," Trish turned. An older man had risen from his seat, silver-haired and straight-backed, with eyes that seemed to absorb everything they touched. He was looking directly at the man in 8A. "I saw you react when the captain made that call." The old man's voice carried the weight of decades of command. "Most people look confused. You did not. Your breathing changed. Your posture shifted. You knew exactly what it meant." He took a step into the aisle, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who had done this before. Addressed crowds, taken charge, made decisions when others froze. "So I am asking once, and I need a straight answer. Are you military?" Every eye in the forward cabin turned towards seat 8A. Trish watched the man beside her process the question. Watched something move behind his eyes, a war being fought in silence. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been resting on his thighs, curled slowly into fists. "I was Air Force," he said finally. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "I am not anymore." "How long? In 5 years." "What did you fly?" The hesitation stretched. Too many people watching. Too many expectations forming in real time. F-16 Sound. The reaction rippled through the cabin like a wave. Sharp intakes of breath. Whispered exclamations. Someone started to cry. Trish stared at him, seeing him clearly for the first time since she had sat down. The leather jacket, the tattoos, the ring, and beneath all of it, hidden so carefully she had missed it entirely, the truth. He was not a criminal. He was a combat pilot. The old man nodded once. Decisive. Final. Then get up. The man in 8A shook his head slowly. "I do not fly anymore. I have not touched a stick in 5 years. I made a promise." The old man's voice hardened but not unkindly. "I do not know what is happening in that cockpit, but that captain would not be making that call unless it was bad. Real bad. Maybe you can help. Maybe you cannot. But you are the only person on this plane with combat flight training. That makes you the only option we have got." He paused, letting the truth settle. "So I am asking you, please, get up." The aircraft shuddered again. Lights flickered. The crying grew louder. Trish watched the man beside her look toward the window, watched him stare at his own reflection, at the leather and the ink and the life he had built so carefully away from moments like this. And then he looked at the cabin, at the mother holding her sleeping toddler 3 rows ahead, at the businessman gripping his useless phone, at the teenage girl with tears streaming down her face, at the old man standing in the aisle asking him to become someone he had promised to leave behind. He was going to say no. Trish could see it forming on his face. The refusal, the excuse, the retreat back into the careful life he had constructed. And something inside her broke. She did not plan to speak, did not think about the words before they left her mouth. They simply erupted, propelled by 3 years of rage and grief, and the sudden irrational certainty that she could not watch another man choose cowardice. She stood up. The movement was so abrupt that she knocked her purse to the floor, scattering its contents across the aisle. She did not care. She was not looking at the purse. She was looking at him. "You have a daughter." Her voice was sharp, cutting, the voice she used in negotiations when the other side thought they could push her around. His eyes snapped to hers, shocked. How did she know that? The answer was simple. She had heard him checking his phone before takeoff, had seen the smile that crossed his face when he read whatever message he received. She knew that smile. She had seen it on Michael's face 1,000 times. "You have a daughter," she repeated, "and there are 50 other children on this plane. Mothers and fathers and grandparents, people who matter to someone." She pointed toward the window, toward the endless darkness beyond. "You are the only one who can help them. The only one. And you are going to sit there and let them die because you made a promise." He stared at her. Something moved in his eyes, something that looked like pain. You do not understand, then make me understand. Her voice cracked, but she did not stop. Make me understand why you would choose your daughter over everyone else's daughters, over everyone else's sons, over all of us. The cabin had gone completely silent, every passenger watching, every breath held. My husband was a Marine, Trish said, and the words felt like glass in her throat. He came home from 3 deployments, survived everything the world threw at him. And then he killed himself in our garage because none of his brothers, none of the men who promised they would be there for him, none of them showed up when he needed them most. Her vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. I have spent 3 years hating men like you, hating the leather jackets and the motorcycles and the brotherhood that means nothing when it matters. I looked at you when I sat down and I saw everything I despise. She took a breath, steadied herself. But right now, you are the only thing standing between 247 people and a very bad ending. So I am asking you, begging you, stop being the man I thought you were and start being the man you actually are. He stared at her, the silence stretched, and then slowly he stood. The woman in 8B, Patricia Bellworth, watched him rise, watched him move past her into the aisle, his body unfolding from the cramped seat with the economy of motion she had learned to associate with men who had been trained to act under pressure. He paused for just a moment, looking back at her. What was your husband's name? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in months, years maybe. Everyone tiptoed around Michael's memory as if speaking his name might break her. Michael, she said. Michael Bellworth. The man nodded once. Acknowledgement. Respect. I am sorry for your loss. Then he turned and walked toward the cockpit, and Patricia Bellworth sank back into her seat, with her hands shaking and her heart pounding, and the sudden terrifying awareness that she had just done something that could not be undone. The old man, Sergeant Major Douglas Keller, fell into step beside him. What is your name, son? Garrett Cole. They shook hands without breaking stride. Sergeant Major Douglas Keller. Retired Army. Thank you. Garrett nodded, not trusting himself to speak. A flight attendant appeared ahead of them, her face flooding with relief. You are a pilot? Close enough, Garrett said. Take me to the cockpit. She led them forward, weaving through passengers who had spilled into the aisle past the galley, where catering carts sat abandoned past the first-class curtain to the locked door that separated the cockpit from the rest of the aircraft. She knocked. 3 sharp raps. A pause. 2 more. A code. The lock clicked. The door swung open, and Garrett Cole stepped through into a nightmare. Captain Warren Hendricks was slumped in the left seat. His body sagged against the harness at an unnatural angle, head tilted to one side, the right half of his face slack and drooping. One arm hung uselessly against the armrest. His breathing was shallow, ragged, barely there. Stroke. Garrett recognized it instantly. The first officer was still flying the plane barely. Young, maybe 28, with both hands locked around the yoke so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Sweat soaked through his uniform despite the cool air. His jaw was clenched so hard it looked painful. Are you? He started, his voice cracking. Please tell me you are a pilot. I was, Garrett said, moving behind the captain's seat. F-16S, military. Relief flashed across the young man's face. Then doubt just as fast. We have lost both hydraulic systems. Both. I am in manual reversion. The controls are barely responding, and I do not know how long. How long since you lost the systems? Garrett interrupted, his voice steady, almost detached. Training taking over. 10 minutes, maybe 12. Captain Hendricks was troubleshooting when he collapsed. Garrett's eyes swept the instrument panel. It was a wall of failure. Warning lights glowed red and amber across the board. Hydraulic pressure indicators sat hard at 0. Master caution flashed insistently. Altitude was holding, but only just. What is your name, Nathan? First Officer Nathan Bradshaw. Okay, Nathan, listen to me carefully. I have flown aircraft with degraded hydraulics before. Not this size, not this configuration. But the principles are the same. We are going to work together. Understood. Nathan nodded, throat bobbing. Good. Talk to me about fuel. Nathan glanced at the gauges, enough to make Reykjavik with some margin. Maybe 40 minutes reserve. Nearest airfield with full emergency response, Keflavik Air Base. Former NATO facility. Long runway. Full crash equipment. How far? 82 miles, about 13 minutes at current speed. 13 minutes. Garrett did the math automatically. 13 minutes to diagnose, stabilize, descend lineup, and land a wide-body commercial jet with no hydraulics. Not much time, but maybe enough. He reached down and checked Captain Hendrick's pulse. Weak but steady. The man was alive, but he needed a hospital, not a cockpit. "We are moving him," Garrett said. "If he comes to disoriented, he could interfere with the controls." Together, carefully, they eased Hendricks out of the seat and into the jump seat, behind them securing the harness across his chest. He did not wake. Garrett slid into the captain's seat. The yoke felt wrong immediately. Too large, too heavy, nothing like the precise, responsive stick of a fighter jet. This aircraft had been designed for smooth assisted flight. None of that assistance existed anymore. He applied gentle pressure. The response lagged, mushy and delayed. Nathan Garrett said, "Declare a mayday with Keflavik Tower. Tell them we are coming in with complete hydraulic failure. No flaps, no brakes. We need the full runway and emergency equipment staged." Nathan keyed the radio with shaking hands. And in the cabin behind them, 247 people waited in the dark, their lives suspended somewhere between hope and terror, their fates now resting in the hands of a man who had promised his daughter he would never fly again. Patricia Bellworth sat in seat 8B, staring at the empty seat beside her. The leather jacket was still there, draped over the armrest where he had left it. She could smell him on it, motor oil and something else, something that reminded her of Michael's uniforms after he came home from the field. She had not meant to tell him about Michael. 3 years of silence, 3 years of carefully constructed walls, and she had torn them down in 30 seconds in front of a cabin full of strangers. Because of a man she did not know. Because of children she would never meet again. Because something inside her had finally cracked wide open. The aircraft shuddered again, and she gripped her armrests with the same white-knuckled intensity she had seen in the first officer's hands. Around her the cabin waited. Some passengers prayed. Others cried. A few sat in stunned silence, processing news they could not fully comprehend. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, their voices calm and steady, despite the fear behind their eyes. "We have a pilot in the cockpit," one of them announced. "An experienced military pilot. Please remain calm and follow all instructions." Military pilot. Trish thought about the way Garrett Cole had looked at her before he turned away. The surprise in his eyes when she told him about Michael. The respect in his voice when he said he was sorry. He had not argued with her, had not defended himself or explained himself or made excuses for the judgment she had thrown at him. He had simply listened, and then he had stood up. Maybe she thought she had been wrong about more than she realized. Sergeant Major Dutch Keller had returned to his seat, but he did not sit down. He stood in the aisle facing the cabin, his presence a focal point for the scattered fear around him. "Listen to me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of command. "Whatever is happening in that cockpit, that man is going to handle it. I have seen 1,000 soldiers in my career. I know what capability looks like. That man has it." He looked around the cabin, meeting eyes, holding gazes. "Our job now is simple. Stay calm, follow instructions, trust the people who know what they are doing." A woman near the front raised her hand like a student in a classroom. "Who is he? Who is the pilot?" Dutch paused, considered the question. "His name is Garrett Cole. He flew F-16S in combat. He has more experience with emergencies than anyone else on this aircraft. And right now he is the best chance we have got." The woman nodded slowly. Something in her face shifted. Not quite hope, but something close to it. Dutch turned and made his way forward toward the front of the cabin, toward the cockpit door that remained closed and locked. He did not know if Garrett Cole could save them, but he believed it was possible, and sometimes belief was enough. In the cockpit, Garrett Cole felt the weight of 247 lives pressing down on him with every degree of altitude they lost. The aircraft was dying, slowly, steadily, inevitably. Without hydraulics, every control surface required manual force that the human body could barely provide. The yoke fought him constantly, trying to pitch up or down or roll to one side or the other. He could feel his arms beginning to burn. "Nathan," he said, "here is how we are going to do this. Without hydraulics, we cannot fly this plane the way it was designed to be flown. So we are going to fly it the way I would land a fighter, with a shot-out system." Nathan stared at him, using engine thrust for control. Differential thrust, Garrett confirmed. I need to turn right, I add power to the left engine, pull power from the right. Pitch up, increase power on both. Every input will lag by about 2 seconds. Rough and imprecise. Nathan shook his head. That is insane. It is all we have got. Garrett's mind was already mapping the approach. High and fast, no other option. Flare at the last second using engine power alone. Touchdown violent. Ride the landing gear as long as it held, then let the arrestor bed do the rest. Simple. Except nothing about it was simple. I need you on the throttles, Garrett said. I call power settings. You execute exactly what I say. No hesitation, no second guessing. My hands stay on the yoke. Yours stay on the thrust levers. We work as one, or this does not work at all. Clear, Nathan swallowed. Clear. Garrett checked the navigation display. 60 miles out, 10 minutes. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Probably Rosemary. Probably wondering why he had not texted after landing as planned. He pictured her in her kitchen coffee going cold, checking the news with half an eye while Lily slept upstairs. He pictured Lily herself, 9 years old, believing with absolute certainty that her father would come home. That pancakes would happen. That promises were unbreakable things. Saturday morning, sweetheart. Blueberry pancakes, I promised. Another warning light flickered on the panel. We just lost auxiliary pressure, Nathan said, voice tightening. I know, Garrett replied. How long until we are completely dry? Hard to say. Could be 5 minutes. Could be 2. Garrett nodded once. Then we do not waste time. He keyed the intercom. Flight attendants, this is the cockpit. We are approximately 8 minutes from landing. Prepare the cabin for an emergency landing. Brace positions on my command. Expect a hard touchdown. Do you copy? A woman's voice came back controlled but strained. Copy cockpit. Preparing cabin now. Garrett released the mic and refocused. The coastline of Iceland was visible now. A dark, uneven shape against an even darker ocean. Sparse lights glimmered in the distance. And ahead, clearer and brighter, was the runway at Keflavik Air Base. A single hard line of light cutting through volcanic black. 10,000 feet of asphalt. An arrestor bed waiting beyond it. And between them and safety, nothing but skill and luck and the desperate hope that both would be enough. In seat 8B, Patricia Bellworth closed her eyes and thought of Michael. Not the Michael who had died. Not the Michael who had become a stranger in the months before the end. The Michael who had loved her. The Michael who had proposed on a beach at sunset and cried when their first child was born and held her hand through every storm their marriage had weathered. If you can hear me, she whispered so softly that even she could barely hear the words, help him. Help us. Please. She did not know if she believed in an afterlife, did not know if Michael could hear her from wherever he was now. But she prayed anyway, because sometimes prayer was all you had left. Garrett Cole began the descent. There was no autopilot, no flight director. Just his hands on the yoke and his eyes on the instruments making constant, precise corrections to keep the aircraft from slipping into something it could not recover from. 60 miles from Keflavik, 8 minutes to live or die. And somewhere in his pocket, a letter from his daughter that he had not yet read. Lily had given it to him that morning before he left for the airport. A folded piece of paper sealed with a heart-shaped sticker pressed into his hand with the solemn intensity that only a 9-year-old could summon. Do not open it until you really need it, she had said. He had laughed and kissed her forehead and tucked it into his jacket without thinking. Now, as the aircraft shuddered and groaned around him, as the lives of 247 people hung in the balance between his skill and the laws of physics, he wondered what she had written. He wondered if he would live long enough to find out. Nathan's voice cut through his thoughts. 50 miles out, beginning descent. Garrett tightened his grip on the yoke. Here we go. The cockpit had become a crucible. Warning lights painted everything in shades of amber and red, casting shadows that danced across the instrument panel like flames licking at the edges of a dying fire. The air tasted of sweat and fear, and the metallic tang of systems pushed beyond their breaking point. Garrett Cole held the yoke with both hands, feeling the aircraft fight him with every muscle fiber in his arms. The Boeing 757 had been designed to fly smoothly, assisted by hydraulic systems that amplified human input into precise, effortless control. Without those systems, the plane had become something else entirely. A beast that wanted to deke and was taking everyone aboard with it. 45 miles to Keflavik, 7 minutes. The descent rate crept upward on the vertical speed indicator, 800 feet per minute, then 900, then 1,000. Too fast. Garrett eased back on the yoke, fighting against controls that felt like they were embedded in concrete. The nose rose a fraction of a degree. The response lagged. Settled, 900 feet per minute. Better. Not good, but better. Nathan Bradshaw sat rigid in the first officer's seat, his hands hovering over the thrust levers like a pianist preparing for the most important performance of his life. His face had gone pale beneath the emergency lighting, but his eyes were focused, alert. Whatever panic had gripped him earlier had been forced down, locked away in whatever compartment young pilots learned to build when training met reality. "Talk to me," Nathan Garrett said. His voice was steady, almost conversational. The calm that came not from absence of fear, but from long practice at functioning despite it. "Airspeed. 218 knots," Nathan replied. "Climbing, expected. Without flaps, they could not slow down without losing altitude. Without losing altitude, they could not maintain lift. The equation was merciless. They would hit the runway fast, dangerously fast, nearly 60 knots faster than a normal landing speed. Garrett had done the math 3 times. Each time, the numbers came out the same. This was going to hurt. He keyed the radio. Keflavik Tower, Air Atlantic 447, 40 miles out. Beginning descent from flight level 350. Request vectors for straight-in approach, runway 20. The response came back immediately, calm and professional, with a distinctive lilt of Icelandic English. "Air Atlantic 447 Keflavik Tower copies. You are cleared direct Kapla intersection descend and maintain flight level 240. Expect vectors for ILS runway 20. Emergency equipment is positioning. Confirm souls on board. 247 passengers," Garrett said. 12 crew, 2 pilots, 1 passenger with medical training assisting in the cockpit. He glanced at the jump seat where Captain Warren Hendricks remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. The man who should have been flying this aircraft was now just another life depending on Garrett's hands. "Copy 447, 261 souls. Confirmed nature of emergency. Complete hydraulic failure," Garrett said. "Both primary systems. Backup is gone. We are in manual reversion with differential thrust for directional control. No flaps, no slats, no spoilers. Landing gear status unknown. We will attempt a gear down landing, but if that fails, we are coming in on the belly." A pause on the other end, just long enough to suggest that whoever was working that frequency understood exactly how bad this was. "Understood 447. Runway 20 is 10,000 feet. Engineered arrestor bed at the departure end. Fire and rescue are standing by. Winds are 210 at 8 knots. Altimeter 2992. You are cleared for the approach." "Godspeed. Godspeed." Garrett almost laughed. He was going to need more than that. In the cabin, the word had spread. Not through any official announcement. Not through the calm, measured voices of the flight attendants who continued to move through the aisles with professional composure. It spread the way fear always spreads. Through whispers, through glances, through the particular quality of silence that settles over people who have realized they might be living their final minutes. Patricia Bellworth sat in seat 8B with her hands folded in her lap, forcing herself to breathe slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The technique Michael had taught her during their first year of marriage, when her anxiety about his deployments had threatened to consume her. It did not feel like enough now. Around her, the cabin had transformed. The comfortable anonymity of commercial flight had evaporated, replaced by something rawer, more human. Strangers who had boarded as isolated individuals, we were now reaching across armrests, holding hands, sharing space in ways that would have felt intrusive an hour ago. A mother 3 rows ahead cradled her sleeping toddler against her chest, one hand cupped protectively around the back of his head. Her lips moved constantly, forming words too quiet to hear. A prayer, maybe, or a lullaby, or simply the repeated assurance that everything would be all right, spoken as much for herself as for the child who slept on, oblivious to the danger. A businessman in the row behind Trish hunched over his phone thumbs, moving in frantic bursts, despite the complete absence of signal. He was composing a message he could not send to someone he might never see again, because the act of writing was the only thing keeping him from screaming. A teenage girl near the window had gone completely still, her face pressed against the glass, staring at the darkness outside as if she could will the ground to appear beneath them. Her father held her hand, squeezing it in a slow, steady rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. "We are going to be okay, honey. The pilot knows what he is doing." He did not know anything about the pilot. None of them did. They knew only that a stranger had walked into the cockpit when no one else could, and that their lives now depended entirely on whatever skills that stranger possessed. Trish closed her eyes. She thought about the moment she had confronted Garrett Cole, the words that had erupted from her without planning or permission. The way she had thrown Michael's death at him like a weapon, using her husband's memory to shame a stranger into action. It had worked. But at what cost? She had spent 3 years building walls around Michael's memory, protecting herself from the pain of it, refusing to speak his name in public, to share their story with anyone who might offer sympathy or understanding. She had transformed her grief into something hard and cold, a stone she carried in her chest, instead of a wound that might eventually heal. And now, in the span of 30 seconds, she had torn all of that down. For a man she did not know, for people she would never see again, for a reason she could not fully explain even to herself. The aircraft shuddered and Trisha's eyes snapped open. Something had changed. The pitch of the engines, the angle of the floor beneath her feet. They were descending, actually descending, moving towards something instead of simply through it. A flight attendant appeared in the aisle, her face composed into the particular expression of calm that professionals learn to project in emergencies. Her name tag read Maria Castellano, and despite the fear Trish could see lurking behind her eyes, her voice was steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are approximately 6 minutes from landing. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened securely across your hips. Remove any sharp objects from your pockets. Remove eyeglasses and store them in the seat pocket in front of you." She demonstrated each instruction as she spoke, her movements practiced and precise. "When the captain gives the command to brace, please assume the following position." Maria bent forward, placing her hands flat against the seat back in front of her, tucking her head between her arms. "Stay in this position until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and you receive further instructions. Do not attempt to retrieve any belongings. When directed to evacuate, move quickly to the nearest exit and leave everything behind." She straightened and looked around the cabin, making eye contact with as many passengers as she could. "Are there any questions?" A man near the back raised his hand. "What happened? Why are we landing early?" Maria hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "We have experienced a technical issue that requires us to land at an alternate airport. The captain and first officer are handling the situation with the assistance of a qualified pilot who happened to be on board. We are in good hands." A qualified pilot who happened to be on board. Trish almost laughed at the understatement. A biker with tattoos and a leather jacket. A man she had judged and dismissed before he ever opened his eyes. A man who was now fighting to save all of their lives because she had shamed him into standing up. Maria continued down the aisle, repeating her instructions to the next section of passengers. As she passed row 8, she glanced at the empty window seat, at the leather jacket still draped over the armrest. Then she looked at Trish. Something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or solidarity. The acknowledgement of two women who understood that they were each playing roles in a story that might not have a happy ending. "He is going to get us down," Maria said quietly. "I believe that." Trish nodded. She wanted to believe it too. Sergeant Major Dutch Keller had positioned himself near the front of the cabin, close enough to the cockpit door to respond if needed, far enough back to maintain a clear view of the passengers behind him. He stood in the aisle with his feet planted and his hands clasped behind his back, a posture so ingrained by decades of service that he assumed it without thinking. Around him, fear rippled through the cabin like wind across water, touching everyone moving, everyone threatening to build into something uncontrollable. Dutch had seen panic before, had seen what happened when groups of people lost their grip on rationality and gave in to the animal instincts that lurk beneath every civilized surface. He had seen soldiers break, had seen civilians flee into danger instead of away from it, had seen the terrible things that fear could make people do when they stopped thinking and started simply reacting. He would not allow that to happen here. "Listen to me," he said, his voice cutting through the whispers and the crying with the authority of a man who had commanded thousands. "We have 6 minutes. 6 minutes to land this aircraft. 6 minutes to do exactly what the flight attendants tell us. 6 minutes to trust the people who know what they are doing." He turned slowly, meeting eyes throughout the cabin. "I have been in situations like this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. I have seen what happens when people stay calm, and I have seen what happens when they do not. The people who stay calm survive. The people who panic make it harder for everyone else to survive." A woman in the middle section was crying, her shoulders shaking with barely suppressed sobs. Dutch looked at her directly. "You," he said. "What is your name?" She looked up, startled. "Catherine," she managed. "Catherine Wells," Catherine Dutch said. "You have every right to be scared. Every single person on this aircraft is scared, including me. But I need you to take that fear and put it somewhere. Box it up. Lock it away. You can take it out later when we are on the ground, when we are safe, but right now I need you to breathe. Can you do that for me?" She stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. "Good," Dutch said. "Now I need everyone else to do the same thing. Box it up, lock it away. We deal with it later. Right now we have a job to do, and that job is to sit still, follow instructions, and let the pilot do his work." He paused, letting the words settle. "His name is Garrett Cole. He flew F-16ES in combat. He has more hours in emergency situations than anyone else on this aircraft. And right now he is giving everything he has to get us down safely. The least we can do is not make his job harder." The cabin had gone quiet, not the brittle silence of fear, but something different. Calmer, more focused. Dutch nodded once satisfied. Then he turned and walked forward, toward the cockpit door, toward whatever was happening on the other side. He did not knock, did not try to enter. He simply stood there, a silent presence, ready to help if called upon, ready to bear witness if help was not needed. Behind that door, a man he barely knew was fighting to save them all. Dutch believed he would succeed. He had to believe it. In the cockpit, Garrett felt the aircraft shudder as they descended through 24,000 feet. The turbulence had returned, not severe, but enough to make the already difficult job of flying without hydraulics even harder. Each gust of wind required correction. Each correction required physical effort. His arms were burning now, muscles screaming in protest as he fought to keep the nose level and the wings steady. 30 miles out, Nathan reported, descending through 2 to 3,000. Rate of descent 1,200 feet per minute. Too fast. Garrett pulled back on the yoke, fighting the aircraft's desire to dive. The nose rose reluctantly, as if the plane itself had given up and was simply waiting to hit the ground. "Power," Garrett said. "Add 5% on both engines." Nathan moved the thrust levers. The engine spooled up with a deep physical roar that Garrett felt through the frame of the aircraft, through the seat, through his bones. The descent rate slowed. 1,000 feet per minute, 900, 800, holding at 800, Nathan said. "Good. Keep monitoring." Garrett's eyes swept the instrument panel, cataloging failures. The list was long. Hydraulic system 1 failed. Hydraulic system 2 failed. Backup hydraulic system failed. Flaps inoperative. Slats inoperative. Spoilers inoperative. Speed brakes inoperative. Nose wheel steering inoperative. And then there was the landing gear. "Nathan," he said, "have we attempted to lower the gear?" Nathan shook his head. "Hydraulics were already failing when I tried. The lever moved, but no indication, no green lights, no red lights, nothing." Garrett considered the options. Normal gear extension required hydraulic pressure. Without hydraulics, the gear could be lowered using an alternate system, gravity and mechanical release. But there was no guarantee the system would work. No guarantee the gear would lock in place. No guarantee they would even know if it had extended until they touched down. If the gear was down and locked, they would land hard but survivable. If the gear was not down or partially down, they would be landing on the belly of the aircraft. The fuselage would strike the runway, tearing metal, generating friction, creating sparks that could ignite fuel. "Try the alternate extension," Garrett said. The gravity drop. Nathan reached for the alternate gear handle, a yellow striped lever located on the center pedestal. He pulled it with a sharp, decisive motion. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then faintly, they felt a series of vibrations through the airframe. the sound of mechanical components moving, the gear doors opening, the heavy landing gear assemblies beginning their descent. Garrett watched the gear indicators. Nothing. The lights remained dark. No indication, Nathan said, his voice tight. I felt something, but no green lights. They might be down, Garrett said. They might not. We will not know until we touch. Nathan turned to look at him. What do we do? We plan for the worst, Garrett said. We assume the gear is not down. We prepare for a belly landing. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. A belly landing meant no wheels to absorb the impact. Meant the bottom of the fuselage would strike the runway at nearly 200 knots, grinding across the asphalt, generating temperatures hot enough to ignite jet fuel. Meant fire crews standing by would not be a precaution, but a necessity. Garrett keyed the radio. Keflavik Tower, Air Atlantic 447. We have attempted alternate gear extension. No positive indication. We are assuming gear up and planning for a belly landing. Request foam on the runway. Another pause. Longer this time. Air Atlantic 447 Keflavik Tower copies. Be advised, foam deployment will take approximately 3 minutes. Runway 20 will be ready when you arrive. Copy Tower. 3 minutes is acceptable. Garrett released the mic and looked at Nathan. Here is what happens next. We come in high and fast. There is no other way. Without flaps, we cannot slow down enough to land at normal speeds. Our touchdown will be approximately 190 knots. Maybe faster, Nathan swallowed. Once we touch, we cut engines immediately. Kill all power. The aircraft will slide on its belly until friction and the arrestor beds stop us. There will be fire. The crash crews will handle it. Our job is to get the aircraft down in one piece and keep it on the runway. What about the passengers? Garrett's jaw tightened. The flight attendants will handle the evacuation. The moment we stop moving, every exit opens. Everyone gets out. We do not wait for fire crews. We do not wait for stairs. We go. And if we do not stop, Garrett did not answer. They both knew what would happen if they did not stop. The arrestor bed was designed to absorb a certain amount of energy. Beyond that threshold, the aircraft would continue off the end of the runway into whatever lay beyond. Garrett did not know what lay beyond. He did not want to find out. 20 miles out, Nathan said. Descending through 15,000. Gear up, full stop. They were committed now. Garrett felt the weight of it settle over him like a physical thing. The weight of 247 lives, the weight of every decision he had made in the last 15 minutes. The weight of the promise he had made to his daughter and the promise he was about to break. He thought about Lily, about the way she laughed when he flipped pancakes too high and pretended it was an accident, about the serious expression she wore when she was thinking hard about something, her brow furrowed, her lips pressed together, about the sound of her voice when she said goodnight, the way she always added one more question, one more delay, one more reason to keep him in her room just a little longer. Do you love me, Daddy? More than anything in the world, sweetheart. Even more than flying. He had hesitated then, just for a moment, long enough for her to notice. Yes, he had said, even more than flying. She had smiled and closed her eyes, satisfied with the answer, unaware of what it had cost him to give it. He had meant it. He still meant it. But right now in this cockpit, with this aircraft dying around him, he could not think about Lily, could not think about pancakes or bedtime stories or the life he had built so carefully around the absence of the sky. He could only think about the next 15 minutes, about the runway waiting in the darkness ahead, about the 247 people trusting him to get them there alive. Focus, he told himself, just focus. The aircraft shuddered as they descended through 10,000 feet. In the cabin, Maria Castellano had finished her rounds and taken her own seat near the forward galley. Her ankle throbbed where she had twisted it during the turbulence earlier, the same turbulence that had prompted Captain Hendricks to investigate and ultimately triggered the cascade of failures that brought them to this moment. She had wrapped it tightly with an elastic bandage from the first aid kit, but the pain was constant, a sharp reminder of how quickly everything could change. She had been a flight attendant for 23 years, had flown through thunderstorms and mechanical problems and the aftermath of September 11th, had dealt with drunk passengers and medical emergencies and the thousand small crises that made up the invisible architecture of commercial aviation. She had never experienced anything like this. The cabin was quiet now, quieter than she had ever heard it on a full flight. The crying had mostly stopped. The whispered conversations had faded. People sat in their seats, hands folded, eyes forward, waiting for whatever came next with the particular resignation of those who understood they had no control over the outcome. Maria looked at the passengers she had spent the last 6 hours serving. The mother with the toddler still holding him close, still whispering words he could not understand. The businessman with his phone still typing his unsendable message, still clinging to the illusion of connection. The teenage girl and her father still holding hands, still breathing together, still refusing to let go. And in row 8, the woman who had confronted the pilot. Patricia something. Maria did not know her last name, did not know anything about her except that she had stood up when everyone else stayed seated, had found words when everyone else stayed silent, had demanded action when everyone else had already surrendered to fate. That woman had changed everything. Maria did not know why she had done it, did not know what personal history had given her the courage or the desperation to challenge a stranger in front of an entire cabin full of terrified people. But she knew with a certainty that transcended logic that without that woman's intervention, they would not have a pilot in the cockpit right now. They would have nothing. Maria closed her eyes and said a silent prayer for Patricia, something. Then she said one for Garrett or Cole. Then she said one for all of them. 5 minutes out, Nathan said, descending through 5,000 feet. Garrett could see the runway now. It emerged from the darkness ahead like a promise, a bright ribbon of light cutting through the volcanic black of the Icelandic landscape. The approach lights blinked in sequence, drawing a path through the night. The runway edge lights glowed steady white, marking the boundaries of the only piece of ground that mattered. Behind the runway, strobing red and blue, the emergency vehicles had taken their positions. Fire trucks, ambulances, crash rescue units, all of them waiting, all of them hoping they would not be needed. Garrett knew better. They would be needed. Keflavik Tower, Air Atlantic 447, 5-mile final runway 20, gear status unknown. Request final confirmation of foam deployment. The response came back immediately. Air Atlantic 447, Keflavik Tower. Foam is deployed, runway is ready, winds 210 at 8 knots. You are cleared to land runway 20. Cleared to land. Garrett acknowledged. He released the mic and turned to Nathan. Here is what I need from you. When I call for power changes, you execute them instantly. No hesitation, no confirmation. Just move the levers. Nathan nodded. When we touch down, I will call for emergency shutdown. You kill everything. Engines, electrical, all of it. The moment we stop moving, we evacuate. You take the first officer's window. I will assist with the captain. What about the passengers? The flight attendants will handle it. That is what they are trained for. Our job is to get this aircraft stopped and then get out of the way. Nathan nodded again, his jaw set. One more thing, Garrett said. Whatever happens in the next 3 minutes, you did everything right. You kept this aircraft flying when it wanted to be. You called for help when you needed it. You trusted someone you had never met. That takes courage. Nathan stared at him. Thank you, he said quietly. Garrett turned back to the windscreen, 2 miles out. The runway was growing larger, filling more of the view with each passing second. The foam on the surface glistened under the lights, a white carpet of fire retardant that would cushion their landing and suppress any flames that might erupt. Garrett tightened his grip on the yoke. His arms were shaking now, the muscles exhausted from 20 minutes of fighting unassisted controls. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, could feel the sweat running down his back despite the cool air in the cockpit. But his hands were steady. His mind was clear. This was what he had been trained for. This was what he had spent 1,200 hours learning to do. Not flying in perfect conditions, but flying when everything went wrong. Finding solutions when there were no good options. Bringing aircraft home when the aircraft did not want to come home. He had walked away from this life 5 years ago, but he had never stopped being a pilot. 1 mile out. The threshold lights were visible now, rushing toward them with terrifying speed. The numbers painted on the runway surface, 2 and 0, grew larger with each heartbeat. Garrett began his flare. In a normal landing, the flare was a gentle maneuver. A slight pull on the yoke to raise the nose, bleeding off speed, settling the aircraft onto the runway with a controlled kiss of rubber on asphalt. This was not going to be a normal landing. Garrett pulled back on the yoke with everything he had. The nose rose reluctantly, fighting him, the aircraft's natural desire to dive warring against his desperate attempt to level out. Power, he called. Reduce both engines to idle. Nathan pulled the thrust levers back. The engines spooled down. The roar diminished. The aircraft began to sink. Garrett held the nose up, fighting against physics, fighting against fatigue, fighting against the certain knowledge that what came next was going to be violent. 500 feet, 300, 100. The foam-covered runway rushed up to meet them. And in seat 8B, Patricia Bellworth assumed the brace position and thought about Michael. Not the Michael who had died. Not the Michael who had become a stranger. The Michael who had promised her on their wedding night that he would always protect her, that he would always come home, that no matter what happened in the world outside, she would never face it alone. He had broken that promise. But maybe she thought maybe that was not the point. Maybe the point was not whether promises were kept, but whether they were made at all. Whether someone loved you enough to trimmerway, whether they gave you something to believe in, even if they could not guarantee the outcome. Garrett Cole had made a promise to his daughter. He was breaking it right now in this cockpit at this moment. But he was breaking it for the right reasons, for 247 strangers who would never know his name. For a woman in seat 8B who had spent 3 years hating men exactly like him. For a chance, however slim, to make it mean something. The aircraft touched down, and the world exploded into chaos. The belly of the Boeing 757 struck the foam-covered runway at 187 knots. The sound was indescribable. A tearing, grinding, screaming cacophony of metal against asphalt friction, generating heat, generating sparks disappearing into the chemical foam before they could become something worse. The deceleration was brutal. Bodies slammed forward against seatbelts. Overhead bins burst open, raining luggage into the aisle. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swinging wildly on their plastic tubes. The cabin filled with screaming, with crying, with the primal sounds of human beings confronting their own mortality. Garrett held the yoke, centered, fighting to keep the aircraft straight, fighting against forces that wanted to spin them, flip them, tear them apart. The nose dug into the foam, dragging, slowing them. The tail rose slightly, threatening to flip them end over end, then settled back down as speed bled away. Emergency shutdown, Garrett called. Nathan moved instantly, killing the engines, cutting the electrical, plunging the cockpit into emergency lighting. The aircraft continued to slide. 100 knots, 80, 60. The arrestor bed loomed ahead, a field of engineered gravel designed to stop aircraft that could not stop themselves. They hit it at 40 knots, the nose plowing into the material, sending a plume of crushed stone into the air. The deceleration intensified. Garrett was thrown forward against his harness, the straps cutting into his shoulders, his head snapping forward before he caught himself. 20 knots. 10. Stop. The aircraft came to rest at a slight angle, nose buried in the arrestor bed, tail still on the runway behind them. Steam rose from the torn belly. The smell of burned metal and foam filled the air. For 3 heartbeats, there was silence. Then the emergency lights came on, bathing everything in red. And Garrett Cole realized he was still alive. Evacuate, he said, his voice hoarse. Evacuate now. Nathan was already moving, unstrapping himself, pulling the release for the cockpit window, preparing to deploy the escape rope. Behind them, Captain Hendricks groaned. He was waking up. Garrett unstrapped and moved to the captain's seat, helping the older man free of his harness. Warren, can you hear me? Hendricks blinked, confused. What happened? You had a stroke. We landed. We need to get out of the aircraft. Hendricks stared at him. Recognition slowly dawning. Who are you? Garrett almost smiled. I will explain later. Right now we move. In the cabin, Maria Castellano was already on her feet. Her ankles screamed in protest, but she ignored it. Pain was irrelevant. Fear was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was getting 247 people off this aircraft before something worse happened. Release your seatbelts and move to the nearest exit, she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Leave all belongings behind. Do not push. Do not run. Move quickly but calmly. The emergency slides had deployed automatically 8 inflatable chutes extending from the doors on both sides of the aircraft. Passengers were already beginning to move, some stumbling, some crying, all of them desperate to escape the metal coffin that had nearly become their grave. Maria positioned herself at the forward exit, guiding passengers onto the slide, counting them as they went. 1, 2, 3. A mother with a toddler, the child now awake and screaming. 4. A businessman still clutching his phone. 5, 6. A teenage girl and her father still holding hands. 7. The count continued a rhythm that kept Maria focused, kept her functioning, kept her from thinking about what might happen if the fuel ignited before everyone was out. 43, 44. She saw Patricia Bellworth approaching, moving with the deliberate calm of someone who had made peace with whatever came next. "You need to go," Maria said. Patricia shook her head. "I will go last. Everyone else first." Maria stared at her. "That is not how this works." "It is now," Patricia said. "Keep counting." There was no time to argue. Maria turned back to the stream of passengers. 51, 52. Patricia positioned herself at the back of the line, helping passengers who were struggling, supporting an elderly woman whose legs had given out, calming a young man who had frozen in panic. She did not know where the impulse came from, did not know why she felt compelled to stay when every instinct screamed at her to flee. But she knew it was right. She knew this was what Michael would have done. Outside, the aircraft chaos had organized itself into purpose. Fire crews sprayed foam on the smoking fuselage, drowning any potential ignition points in chemical suppression. Paramedics rushed forward with stretchers ready to treat anyone who needed immediate attention. Airport personnel directed the stream of survivors away from the aircraft toward buses that would carry them to the terminal. Garrett emerged from the cockpit window, sliding down the escape rope with Captain Hendricks supported against his side. Nathan followed immediately behind, helping to lower the still disoriented captain to the ground. Paramedics swarmed around them, taking Hendricks, loading him onto a stretcher, beginning the assessment that would continue in the ambulance and the hospital beyond. Garrett stepped back and watched them work. His hands were shaking now. The adrenaline that had carried him through the last 20 minutes was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made it difficult to stand. He looked at the aircraft. The Boeing 757 sat at an angle in the arrestor bed, its belly torn open, its skin blackened by friction, its nose buried in gravel. Steam rose from a dozen wounds in the fuselage. Foam covered everything, a white blanket that made the destruction seem almost peaceful. But everyone was walking away. Every single person who had boarded that aircraft in Seattle was now standing on solid ground, breathing cold Icelandic air, alive. Garrett felt something break inside him. Not pain, not fear, something closer to relief, something closer to absolution. He had broken his promise to Lily, but he had kept a different promise, one he had never spoken aloud, one he had carried since the day he walked away from the cockpit for the last time. The promise to be worthy of the wings he had once worn. The promise to be the man his daughter believed he was. A hand touched his shoulder. He turned. Patricia Bellworth stood behind him, her face streaked with tears, her clothes disheveled, her carefully constructed composure finally and completely abandoned. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, so simple, so inadequate, and yet somehow enough. Garrett nodded. "I did not do it alone," he said. "You made me stand up. You would have stood up anyway." He shook his head. "I do not know if that is true, but I know you were the one who made it happen. Your husband would be proud of you." Patricia's face crumpled. The walls she had spent 3 years building collapsed entirely, and she wept. Not quietly, not privately, but openly, with the full-throated grief of someone who had finally stopped fighting. Garrett did not move away. He simply stood there, a stranger who had become something more, bearing witness to a pain he could not fix but refused to ignore. Around them, the survivors of Air Atlantic Flight 447 continued to stream away from the aircraft. Fire crews continued their work. The dawn began to break over the volcanic coast of Iceland, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. And somewhere in a house in Portland, a 9-year-old girl was waking up to news that would change her life. Rosemary Morrison sat in her kitchen with the television on and her phone in her hand. The news had broken 20 minutes ago. Air Atlantic Flight in emergency landing at Keflavik Air Base. All passengers survived. No fatalities reported. She had tried to call Garrett 6 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. But the television showed passengers evacuating, showed paramedics and fire crews in the organized chaos of a disaster averted, showed faces she did not recognize and would never meet. She watched, waiting, hoping, praying. And then a face she did recognize appeared on the screen. Garrett being helped away from the aircraft by a paramedic. Garrett covered in foam and soot and exhaustion. Garrett alive. Rosemary exhaled. She had not realized she was holding her breath. Aunt Rosemary. The voice came from the hallway, small, uncertain. Lily stood in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair tangled from sleep, her eyes fixed on the television screen. Rosemary quickly changed the channel, but she was too late. Lily had seen. "Is that Daddy's plane?" Lily asked. Rosemary hesitated. She could lie, could protect Lily from the truth until more information was available, could shield her from the fear and uncertainty that adults learn to carry. But Lily deserved better than lies. "Yes, sweetheart," Rosemary said. "That was Daddy's plane." Lily's face went pale. "Is he okay?" Rosemary opened her arms and Lily ran to her, burying her face in her aunt's shoulder. "He is okay," Rosemary said. "I saw him on TV. He is okay." Lily pulled back her eyes wide. "You saw him?" "Yes, he was walking away from the plane. He is safe." Lily's expression shifted. The fear did not disappear entirely, but something else joined it. Something that looked like pride. Was he the one flying the plane? Rosemary did not know how to answer that question. She did not know anything yet, not really. Just fragments from the news reports, speculation, and incomplete information. But she knew her brother. And she knew that if there was an emergency on that aircraft and if they needed a pilot, Garrett would have been the first to volunteer. "I think so, sweetheart," she said. "I think he was." Lily was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "I knew he could not really stop being a pilot." Rosemary felt her heart constrict. "What do you mean?" Lily looked up at her with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than 9. "He pretends he does not miss it. But I hear him sometimes at night talking in his sleep. He says things about flying, about his friends, about being up in the sky." Rosemary did not know what to say. "I do not mind," Lily continued. "I do not mind if he flies again. I just want him to come home." Rosemary pulled her close. "He will," she said. "He always does." Outside the window, the sun was rising over Portland. A new day beginning. A day that would change everything. The sun rose over Keflavik with the indifferent beauty of a world that did not know how close it had come to tragedy. Pink and gold light spilled across the volcanic landscape, painting the black rock in colors that seemed borrowed from another planet. Steam rose from distant geothermal vents, drifting lazily into a sky so clear it hurt to look at directly. The air was cold and clean, carrying the salt smell of the North Atlantic and the chemical tang of fire suppression foam. Patricia Bellworth stood at the edge of the runway, wrapped in a thermal blanket that someone had pressed into her hands at some point during the evacuation. She did not remember who, did not remember much of anything from the minutes immediately following their escape from the aircraft. Just fragments, images, the feel of cold air on her face, the sound of crying that might have been her own. Behind her, the Boeing 757 sat in the arrestor bed like a wounded animal that had finally stopped struggling. Emergency crews still swarmed around it, spraying foam, checking for hotspots, documenting the damage for the investigation that would inevitably follow. The aircraft's belly was torn open, metal peeled back like the skin of a fruit, revealing the complex anatomy of systems that had failed and structures that it had held. It should have been a coffin. It was not. 247 passengers had walked away from that aircraft. 12 crew members. 2 pilots, one of whom had been unconscious for the entire descent. Every single soul who had boarded in Seattle was now standing on solid ground, breathing alive. Because of one man, because of one decision. Because she had opened her mouth and said words she never intended to say. Patricia pulled the thermal blanket tighter around her shoulders and watched the emergency crews work. She should be with the other passengers, she knew. Should be on one of the buses heading to the terminal, should be giving her statement to the authorities, should be calling someone to let them know she was safe. But she could not move. Something had shifted inside her during those final minutes on the aircraft. Something fundamental. The walls she had spent 3 years building had collapsed entirely, and she did not yet know what would rise in their place. Mrs. Bellworth. She turned. A young woman in an airport uniform stood beside her clipboard, in hand expression carefully neutral. "The buses are leaving for the terminal. We need to process all passengers before anyone can leave the airport. There are people from the airline waiting to assist you." Patricia nodded slowly. "Of course," she said. "I understand." She took one last look at the aircraft, at the torn metal and the foam and the evidence of how close they had all come to dying. Then she turned and walked toward the buses, toward whatever came next. Garrett Cole sat in a plastic chair in the Keflavik Airport Medical Facility, staring at his hands. They were still shaking, Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not looking closely, but shaking nonetheless. A fine tremor that he could not control no matter how hard he tried. The adrenaline was fading. The clarity that had carried him through the emergency was dissolving, leaving behind exhaustion, so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on every part of his body. A doctor had examined him 20 minutes ago, checked his vitals, shined a light in his eyes, asked questions about his medical history, pronounced him physically fine, just stressed and tired, nothing that rest would not fix. Garrett had nodded and said nothing. Physical was not the problem. The door opened and a man in a dark suit entered the room. Tall, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in positions of authority. He carried a folder in one hand and extended the other as he approached. "Mr. Cole," he said, "my name is Harold Sigurdsson. I am the Director of Aviation Safety for the Icelandic Transport Authority." Garrett stood and shook the offered hand. "I need to ask you some questions about what happened on that aircraft," Sigurdsson continued. "Standard procedure, nothing adversarial. We just need to understand the sequence of events." Garrett nodded. Of course. They sat across from each other, the small table between them, covered with the folder's contents. Diagrams of the aircraft, printouts of the cockpit voice recorder data, preliminary reports from the flight data recorder. Sigurdsson opened with the obvious question. "Can you walk me through what happened from the moment you entered the cockpit?" Garrett took a breath. And then he talked. He described the scene he had found. Captain Hendricks unconscious, clearly suffering from a stroke. First Officer Bradshaw struggling to maintain control of an aircraft that had lost all three hydraulic systems. Warning lights everywhere. No good options. He described the decisions he had made. Using differential thrust to control the aircraft. Planning for a belly landing when the gear indication failed. Coordinating with Keflavik Tower for foam deployment. He described the landing itself, the approach, the flare, the impact, the slide through the foam and into the arrestor bed. He described it all in the flat, precise language of official reports, stripping away the fear and the doubt, in the moments when he had been absolutely certain they were all going to die. Sigurdsson listened without interrupting. When Garrett finished, the director sat back in his chair and regarded him with an expression that was difficult to read. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I have been investigating aviation incidents for 23 years. I have seen pilots perform extraordinary feats under pressure, and I have seen pilots make mistakes that cost lives." He paused. "What you did on that aircraft was remarkable. You had no legal obligation to intervene, no professional responsibility. You were a passenger who happened to have relevant skills, and yet you chose to enter that cockpit and take control of a situation that most pilots would have found overwhelming." Garrett said nothing. "The data supports your account." Sigurdsson continued. "The flight recorders show that you made the correct decisions at every critical juncture. Your use of deferential thrust to maintain directional control was textbook. Your approach profile was as good as could be expected under the circumstances. And your decision to plan for a belly landing rather than risking a partial gear extension almost certainly saved lives." He closed the folder. "I will be recommending that you receive official recognition from the Icelandic government for your actions. You saved 261 lives today, Mr. Cole. That is not something that should go unacknowledged." Garrett felt something twist in his chest. "I was not alone," he said. "First Officer Bradshaw kept that aircraft flying until I got there. The flight attendants organized the evacuation. And there was a passenger, a woman named Patricia Bellworth. She was the one who convinced me to get out of my seat." Sigurdsson nodded. "We will be acknowledging everyone who contributed, but you were the one who landed that aircraft. That responsibility falls on your shoulders for better or worse." For better or worse. Garrett thought about Lily, about the promise he had made 5 years ago, about the promise he had broken 12 hours ago. "Is there anything else you need from me?" he asked. Sigurdsson shook his head. "Not at the moment. We will need a full written statement eventually, but that can wait until you have rested. For now, there are some people who would like to see you." He stood and opened the door. Sergeant Major Douglas Keller stood in the hallway, his silver hair slightly disheveled, his posture still ramrod straight despite the exhaustion evident in his face. "I told them I was your commanding officer," Dutch said. "Figured it was close enough to the truth." Garrett almost smiled. Close enough. They walked together through the corridors of the airport, past security checkpoints and airline offices, and the bustling activity of a facility that had suddenly become the center of international attention. Reporters had already begun to gather outside cameras and microphones ready to capture whatever story they could extract from the survivors. Dutch steered them away from the main areas through a service corridor that led to a quieter section of the terminal. "How are you holding up?" Dutch asked. Garrett considered the question. "I do not know yet," he said honestly. "Ask me again in a week." Dutch nodded. "That is a fair answer." They found a bench near a window overlooking the tarmac, away from the crowds and the cameras, and the demands of a world that suddenly wanted to know everything about the man who had saved Flight 447. "Can I ask you something?" Garrett said. "Of course. How did you know?" "On the plane when the captain made that announcement. How did you know I was military?" Dutch smiled. "Son, I spent 32 years learning to read people, learning to spot the ones who could handle pressure and the ones who would fold. You carry yourself like someone who has been trained. The way you sit, the way you breathe, the way your eyes track movement. It is not something you can fake, and it is not something you can hide, at least not from someone who knows what to look for." Garrett absorbed this. "And if you had been wrong, if I had been just another biker with a bad attitude, then we would have been in trouble," Dutch said. "But I was not wrong, and neither were you." They sat in silence for a moment, watching aircraft taxi on the runway below. Normal operations resuming, the world moving on. "I lost my wingman," Garrett said suddenly. 5 years ago, last deployment. He took a missile that was meant for me, flew his aircraft into it so I could complete the mission." Dutch said nothing, just listened. "His name was Kevin Walsh. We called him Priest because he never cursed, never drank, never did anything that might disappoint his mother. Best pilot I ever flew with. And he died because I was too slow to see the threat." "You blame yourself," Dutch said. It was not a question. "I blame myself for 5 years, Garrett said. I walked away from flying because I could not stand the thought of being in a cockpit without him. Could not stand the thought that someone else might die because I was not good enough." He paused. "And then today happened. And I was in a cockpit again, and people were depending on me again. And I realized something." What Garrett turned to look at him, Kevin did not die so I could hide. He died so I could keep flying, keep protecting people, keep doing the thing we both loved. And I have been spitting on his memory for 5 years by pretending that giving up was somehow honoring his sacrifice. Dutch nodded slowly. "That is a hard truth to face." "It is," Garrett agreed. "But it is the truth. And I think I am finally ready to live with it." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, two veterans sharing the kind of silence that only those who have served can truly understand. The first letter arrived 3 days later. Garrett was back in Portland by then, reunited with Lily and Rosemary, trying to reclaim some semblance of normal life in the midst of media requests and official inquiries, and the constant, overwhelming attention of a world that had decided he was a hero. The envelope was plain white, addressed by hand, with a return address in Minneapolis. Inside was a photograph in a single sheet of paper. The photograph showed a man in a tuxedo walking a young woman in a white dress down a church aisle. Both were smiling with the particular joy of a moment long anticipated, finally arriving. The letter read, "Mr. Cole, I was the man in seat 14C, the one who could not stop trying to text his wife even though there was no signal. This photograph was taken yesterday. My daughter's wedding. I walked her down the aisle. I danced with her at the reception. I cried when she said her vows. I would not have been there without you. I am a financial analyst. I work with numbers and spreadsheets and quarterly reports. I have never been in a situation where my life depended on someone else's skill and courage. I did not know what that felt like until 3 days ago. Thank you does not begin to cover what I owe you, but thank you anyway. David Hartwell." Garrett sat at his kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a shoebox that would eventually contain hundreds more. "What is that?" Daddy Lily stood in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair wild from sleep. "Someone saying thank you," Garrett said. "For the airplane thing," he smiled. "For the airplane thing." Lily crossed the room and climbed into his lap, settling against his chest with the easy familiarity of a child who had never doubted her father's love. "Are you famous now?" Garrett laughed. "I hope not. Madison at school said she saw you on TV. She said you were a hero." "What do you think?" Lily considered the question with the gravity that only a 9-year-old could muster. "I think you are just my dad," she said finally. "But maybe you are also a hero. Both things can be true." Garrett held her closer. That is a very wise thing to say. I know, Lily said. I am very wise. He laughed again, and the sound surprised him. He had not laughed like that in longer than he could remember. A genuine laugh, an unguarded laugh, the laugh of a man who had finally stopped running from himself. Lily shifted in his arms, looking up at him with an expression that suddenly seemed much older than her years. Daddy, yes, sweetheart. Are you going to fly again? The question landed with unexpected weight. Garrett had been avoiding it for 3 days, avoiding the calls from airlines and aviation consultants and people who wanted to know if Captain Garrett Cole was interested in returning to the cockpit, avoiding the obvious next step that everyone assumed he would take. He looked down at his daughter. Would you be okay with that if I flew again? Lily was quiet for a long moment. I was scared, she said finally. When Aunt Rosemary told me about the plane, I was really scared. I know, sweetheart. I am sorry. But then she said you were the one flying, that you were the one who saved everyone, and I was not scared anymore. No, Lily shook her head. Because I know you, Daddy. I know you would not let anything bad happen. I know you would always come home. Garrett felt his throat tighten. Lily, he said carefully, sometimes things happen that are out of our control. Sometimes people try their best and bad things still happen. I cannot promise that nothing will ever go wrong. I know, Lily said, but you would try. You would try as hard as you could, and that is what matters. She looked up at him with eyes that held more understanding than any child should have to possess. I do not want you to be sad anymore, Daddy. I do not want you to miss flying so much that it hurts. If flying makes you happy, then you should fly. I will be okay. I promise. Garrett stared at his daughter. This 9-year-old girl who had already lost her mother, who had already learned that people sometimes leave and do not come back, who had every reason to cling to the one parent she had left and beg him to stay safe. And instead she was giving him permission to be himself. When did you get so smart? He asked. Lily grinned. I learned from you. He pulled her into a hug so tight she squeaked in protest. I love you, Lily, more than anything in the world. Even more than flying, the same question she had asked him once before. The question he had hesitated to answer. This time he did not hesitate. Even more than flying, he said. But you know what? You are right. I do not have to choose. I can love flying and love you. Both things can be true. Lily nodded against his chest. Both things can be true, she repeated. Outside the kitchen window, the morning sun was climbing higher, filling the room with golden light. Inside, a father and daughter held each other, and for the first time in 5 years, neither of them was afraid. The letters kept coming. One from the teenage girl back in school, now writing that she was not afraid to fly anymore, that she was thinking about becoming a pilot herself, that what Garrett had done had shown her that fear did not have to be the end of the story. One from Nathan Bradshaw, the first officer now in therapy but flying again. He wrote that Garrett had taught him something important about experience, that it was not just hours in the cockpit, but knowing when to ask for help, knowing when to trust someone you had never met. One from the mother with the toddler writing that her son did not remember the flight, which she considered a blessing, but she would never forget. And someday when he was old enough, she would tell him about the man who had saved their lives. One from a woman named Catherine Wells, the one who had been crying in the cabin, the one Dutch Keller had singled out and calmed. She wrote that she had started going to therapy for her anxiety, that Dutch's words had stayed with her, that she was learning to box up her fear and deal with it later, rather than letting it control her in the moment. Garrett read every letter. He answered every one. He kept them all in the shoebox under his bed, a growing archive of gratitude that he pulled out sometimes late at night when sleep would not come and the old doubts tried to creep back in. He was not a hero. He was just a man who had happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills. But maybe that was what heroism actually was. Not superpowers or invulnerability or some special quality that sets certain people apart. Just ordinary people making extraordinary choices when the moment demanded it. 2 weeks after the landing, the news arrived about Douglas Keller. Garrett learned about it from an email forwarded by the airline, which had been contacted by Dutch's daughter in Iceland. The sergeant major had suffered a heart attack in his sleep. He had died peacefully, without pain, surrounded by the family he had traveled so far to visit. Garrett sat with the news for a long time. He had known Dutch for less than an hour, had shared a conversation on a plane and a silence on a bench and nothing else. And yet the loss felt profound, as if something important had been taken from the world. He attended the memorial service 2 months later, flying to Minneapolis, where Dutch had lived and raised his family and built a life after 32 years of military service. The church was packed. Veterans in their dress uniforms sat alongside civilians in dark suits. Flags draped the casket. An honor guard stood at attention, rifles ready for the salute that would mark the end of the service. Garrett sat in the back trying to be inconspicuous. He failed. Halfway through the service, Dutch's daughter approached him. She was in her 40s, with her father's sharp eyes and straight posture. "You are Garrett Cole," she said. He nodded. "My father talked about you after the flight. He said you were the real thing, said he had seen a lot of soldiers in his career and you were one of the best." Garrett did not know what to say. "He left something for you," she continued. "In his will. He had it changed after he got back from Iceland. Before he passed." She handed him a small box. Garrett opened it. Inside was a challenge coin, the kind that military units minted to commemorate their service, to recognize achievement, to bind brothers in arms across time and distance. This one was old and worn, the edges smoothed by decades of handling. On one side was the insignia of the 101st Airborne Division. On the other was an inscription: duty, honor, sacrifice. He always carried that, Dutch's daughter said. Every day for 50 years. He said you had earned the right to carry it next. Garrett held the coin in his palm, feeling its weight, its history, its meaning. "Thank you," he managed. She nodded. "Thank you," she said, "for giving him one more story to tell, for giving him one more moment to be proud of. He had a good death, Mr. Cole, a peaceful death. But I think the flight gave him something to hold on to in those final weeks, a reminder that the things he had spent his life fighting for still mattered." Garrett stayed for the burial. He watched the honor guard fold the flag and present it to Dutch's widow. He watched the rifles fire their salute, 3 volleys that echoed across the cemetery and faded into silence. He watched the casket lower into the ground, and he thought about all the men he had known who had served and sacrificed and died so that others could live. Kevin Walsh, Douglas Keller, so many others. And he thought about the ones who were still here, the ones who were still fighting, the ones who still had time to make their service mean something. He was one of them. He would not waste it. 6 months after the landing, Garrett received a different kind of letter. This one was not from a passenger or a family member or anyone connected to Flight 447. It was from a woman named Patricia Bellworth, and it arrived in an envelope with a logo he did not recognize: the Bellworth Foundation for Veteran Mental Health. He opened it and read, "Dear Mr. Cole, I do not know if you remember me. I was the woman in seat 8B, the one who yelled at you until you got out of your seat. 6 months ago, I was a bitter, angry person who had spent 3 years hating men like you because I blamed them for my husband's death. I saw your leather jacket and your tattoos, and I decided I knew everything I needed to know about who you were. I was wrong. What happened on that flight changed me. Not just the emergency, though that was part of it, but the moment when you looked at me and asked about my husband. The moment when you said you were sorry for my loss. The moment when you treated my grief as something real, even though you had every reason to dismiss me as the judgmental woman who had been silently condemning you since takeoff. I have spent the last 6 months thinking about that moment, and I have come to understand something important. Michael did not die because his brothers failed him. Michael died because we do not talk about the things that destroy us from the inside. Because men are taught to be strong and silent and self-sufficient even when they are drowning. Because asking for help feels like weakness, and weakness feels like failure, and failure feels like death. I cannot bring Michael back, but I can try to change the system that killed him. I have sold my real estate company. I have used the proceeds to establish a foundation dedicated to mental health support for veterans and their families. We provide counseling, support groups, crisis intervention, and community building. We try to create spaces where men can talk about the things they have seen and done without being judged or dismissed or told to man up. I wanted you to know about this because you were part of my awakening, and I wanted to ask if you would consider joining our advisory board. Not because of what happened on the plane, though that would certainly be a compelling story for our fundraising materials, but because you understand, because you have been where these men are. because you walked away from something you loved to protect someone you loved more, and that kind of sacrifice is exactly what we are trying to honor. Please think about it, and thank you for everything. Patricia Bellworth. Garrett read the letter twice. Then he picked up his phone and dialed the number printed at the bottom of the page. The one-year anniversary of Flight 447 arrived on a cold February morning. Garrett woke early as he always did now. The nightmares had faded over the months, replaced by a quiet that felt earned rather than forced. He no longer dreamed of falling aircraft and failing systems. He dreamed of ordinary things, pancakes and homework, and the sound of Lily's laughter. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake his daughter, and walked to the kitchen to start the coffee. The shoebox of letters sat on the counter where he had left it the night before. He had been going through them again, rereading the stories of the lives that had continued because of one decision on one night over the North Atlantic. There were 312 letters now. Not everyone had written, not everyone would, but the ones who had wrote with a rawness that still surprised him. They wrote about weddings and births and promotions, about grandchildren they had lived to meet and milestones they had lived to celebrate, about the small, precious moments that made up a life, moments that would not have existed if things had gone differently that night. Garrett poured his coffee and sat at the table watching the sunrise through the window. He was different now. Not better exactly, not worse, just different. He had started flying again 3 months after the landing. Not commercial aviation, not fighters, but something in between. Charter flights for a company that specialized in emergency medical transport. Patients who needed to get to distant hospitals quickly. Organs that needed to reach recipients before time ran out. It was not the same as combat flying. Nothing would ever be the same as those days in the cockpit of an F-16 dancing through the sky with nothing between him and eternity but skill and luck. But it was enough. It was more than enough. "Daddy!" He turned. Lily stood in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair a tangled mess around her face. She was 10 now. Taller, more serious, but still the same girl who had held his hand through the darkest years of his life. "You are up early," she said. "Could not sleep." She crossed the room and climbed into the chair beside him, tucking her feet up under her the way she always did. "Is today the day?" Garrett nodded. Today is the day. They had talked about this, about the anniversary, about what it meant, about how he wanted to mark it. Lily had listened with the careful attention she gave to everything that mattered, and then she had asked a single question. "Can I come with you?" He had said yes. They drove to the airport together as the sun climbed higher. Not the commercial terminal, but a small airfield on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where private pilots kept their aircraft and weekend flyers practiced their landings, and the sky still felt like something you could touch. Garrett's plane was waiting in the hangar. A Cessna 172, simple and reliable, nothing like the jets he had once flown. But it had wings and an engine and a yoke that responded to his hands, and that was all he needed. He helped Lily into the right seat, adjusting her headset, checking her seatbelt, going through the same pre-flight routine he had performed thousands of times before. "Ready?" he asked. Lily grinned. "Ready." They taxied to the runway, received their clearance, and began their takeoff roll. The engine roared. The runway lights blurred past, and then they were airborne, climbing into a sky so blue it seemed impossible. Garrett leveled off at 3,000 feet and turned west toward the ocean, toward the horizon that stretched endless and eternal before them. Lily pressed her face to the window, watching the world fall away beneath them. "It is so beautiful," she said. "It is," Garrett agreed. They flew in silence for a while, father and daughter suspended between earth and heaven, sharing a moment that words could not improve. Then Lily said, "Do you think about them, the people on the plane?" Garrett nodded. "Every day. Do you think they think about you?" "Some of them," he said. "Some of them write to me. Some of them have moved on." "Both things can be true," Lily smiled. "Both things can be true," she repeated. It had become their phrase, their shorthand for the complicated reality of a world that did not fit into simple categories. Garrett reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I never showed you this," he said. "You gave it to me the morning I left for Iceland. You told me not to open it until I really needed it." Lily's eyes widened. "I remember." Garrett unfolded the paper. It was a drawing, crayon on lined notebook paper, a picture of a man and a girl standing next to an airplane, both of them smiling, both of them waving at the sky. Beneath the drawing in careful 9-year-old handwriting were the words, "Dear Daddy, I know you miss flying. I know you gave it up for me. That makes me happy, but also sad, because you should not have to be sad to make me happy. If you ever need to fly again, I want you to know it is okay. I will always be here when you come home. I will always be proud of you no matter what. I love you more than airplanes. Your daughter Lily. Garrett's vision blurred. He had opened this letter in the medical facility at Keflavik after the landing, after everyone was safe. He had read it through tears. He could not stop tears that had washed away 5 years of guilt and fear and self-imposed exile. His daughter had known, had always known, had been waiting for him to understand what she already understood. That love was not about keeping people safe from everything. It was about giving them the freedom to be who they were meant to be. Lily leaned over and looked at the drawing. I was not very good at art back then, she said. Garrett laughed. I think it is perfect. He folded the paper carefully and returned it to his pocket where it had lived for the past year, where it would live for as long as he was alive to carry it. They flew until the fuel gauge told them it was time to turn back, and then they flew a little longer because some moments were worth stretching as far as they would go. When they landed, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Garrett taxied to the hangar, shut down the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. Lily reached over and took his hand. Thank you, Daddy, she said. For what? For letting me come, for sharing this with me, for being you. Garrett squeezed her hand. Thank you for letting me be me. They climbed out of the aircraft and walked together toward the parking lot, their shadows stretching long behind them. In a few hours, Garrett would attend a virtual memorial organized by some of the Flight 447 survivors. He would see faces he remembered and faces he did not. He would hear stories of lives saved and futures reclaimed. He would be reminded once again that one decision on one night could ripple outward forever. But for now, in this moment, he was just a father, walking with his daughter, breathing the cool evening air, feeling the solid ground beneath his feet. He was home, and that was enough. Patricia Bellworth stood at the window of her office, watching the lights of Portland flicker to life as darkness settled over the city. The Bellworth Foundation occupied the top floor of a renovated building in the Pearl District, a space that had once housed a failing art gallery and now served as the headquarters for one of the fastest-growing veteran mental health organizations in the Pacific Northwest. On the wall behind her desk hung a photograph of Michael. What the official portrait from his Marine Corps days, stiff and formal and impersonal. A candid shot from their 10th anniversary, both of them laughing at something she could no longer remember. Both of them unaware of what the future held. She had burned a photograph like this once in the dark days after his death, had tried to destroy every reminder of the happiness they had shared because happiness felt like a betrayal of grief. She had been wrong about so many things. The door opened behind her. The board meeting is in 10 minutes, her assistant said. Everyone is in the conference room. Patricia nodded without turning around. Thank you. I will be right there. The door closed. Patricia remained at the window, watching the city, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. 1 year ago, she had been a bitter, angry woman who measured her life in closed deals and quarterly profits. A woman who had built walls so high she could no longer see over them. A woman who had decided that grief was safer than hope and isolation was safer than connection. 1 year ago, she had boarded a flight to Iceland and sat next to a man she despised on sight. 1 year ago, she had watched that man stand up and walk into a cockpit to save 261 lives, including her own. Everything had changed after that. She had sold her company, had used the money to build something meaningful, had hired counselors and social workers and veterans who understood the invisible wounds that never showed up on medical scans, had created a network of support that now reached across 3 states and served over 2,000 families. And she had done something else, something smaller but perhaps more important. She had forgiven. Not the men who had failed Michael. She had come to understand that they had not failed him at all. They had loved him as much as they knew how, had tried to reach him in ways that did not penetrate the walls he had built around his pain, had mourned him with a grief as real and profound as her own. No, the forgiveness she had finally found was for Michael himself, for leaving her, for choosing death over life, for breaking the promise he had made on their wedding night to always protect her, to always come home. She had visited his grave last week for the first time in 3 years, had stood in front of the simple headstone and spoken to him as if he could hear. I understand now, she had said. I understand that you were fighting a war I could not see. I understand that you lost. I understand that losing was not a choice. She had placed flowers on the graved white roses, his favorite. I forgive you, she had said, and I hope wherever you are you can forgive me for being so angry for so long. She had cried then, not the violent racking sobs of the early days, a gentler release, a letting go. And when she walked away from the cemetery, she had felt something she had not felt in years, peace. Patricia turned from the window and gathered her notes for the board meeting. There was still so much work to do, so many veterans still struggling, so many families still breaking under the weight of trauma they could not name. But progress was being made. Lives were being saved. The ripples were spreading outward, touching people she would never meet, changing futures she would never see. Because one night on an airplane over the North Atlantic, a stranger had asked her about her husband. Because one night she had found the courage to stand up and demand that another stranger do the same. Because one night 261 people had learned that survival was possible even when hope seemed lost. Patricia walked to the conference room where her board of directors waited. Among them, sitting in his usual seat at the far end of the table, was Garrett Cole. He had joined the board 6 months ago, bringing with him a perspective that no one else could offer. The perspective of a veteran who had walked away from service and found his way back. The perspective of a parent who understood that love sometimes meant letting go. The perspective of a man who had saved hundreds of lives and still considered himself ordinary. He looked up as she entered and their eyes met. No words were necessary, no explanations, no acknowledgments of the strange path that had brought them both to this moment. They had each been changed by what happened on Flight 447. They had each found something they did not know they were looking for. And they had each discovered that the end of one story was always the beginning of another. Patricia took her seat at the head of the table and opened her folder. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "We have a lot to discuss." She looked around at the faces before her. Veterans and civilians, doctors and counselors, people who had dedicated themselves to the mission of helping those who had served. And Garrett watching her with the quiet intensity of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "Let us begin," Patricia said. And they did. Outside the window, the city lights glittered against the darkness. Stars emerged in the clear February sky. Aircraft traced their paths toward distant destinations, their lights blinking steadily as they climbed toward cruising altitude. Somewhere out there, people were boarding flights they would not remember, sitting next to strangers they would never think about again, living ordinary lives that might at any moment become extraordinary. The world kept turning, stories kept unfolding, and in a conference room in Portland, two people who had once been strangers worked together to build something that would outlast them both, because that was what survival meant in the end. Not just continuing to breathe, but finding a reason to breathe deeply, finding a purpose worth fighting for, finding a way to transform the darkest moments into light. Garrett Cole had learned that lesson in the cockpit of a dying aircraft. Patricia Bellworth had learned it in the seat beside him. And now together they were teaching it to others, one life at a time, one story at a time, one day at a time. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it was over, Garrett lingered in the conference room looking out at the city lights. Patricia joined him at the window. "1 year," she said. "1 year," he agreed. They stood in comfortable silence, two people who had shared an experience that defied ordinary language. "Do you ever think about it?" Patricia asked. The flight Garrett nodded. "Every day, but differently now. It used to be nightmares. Now it is mostly gratitude. Gratitude for what? For being alive, for getting a second chance, for Lily, for all of it." Patricia smiled. "I know what you mean." Garrett turned to look at her. "Michael would be proud of you," he said. "What you have built here, what you are doing. He would be proud." Patricia's eyes glistened, but she did not look away. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." Garrett nodded. Then he said, "I should get home. Lily is waiting." "Of course. Give her my best." Garrett gathered his things and walked to the door. He paused, hand on the frame, and looked back. "Same time next month?" he asked. Patricia smiled. "Same time next month." He left, and Patricia returned to the window. Below, she watched him emerge from the building and walk to his motorcycle. A Harley, of course. Some things never changed. He mounted the bike, started the engine, and pulled away into the night. Patricia watched until his taillights disappeared around a corner. Then she turned off the lights and headed home herself, Tomorrow there would be more work, more meetings, more lives to touch. But tonight, for a few quiet hours, she would rest. She had earned it. They all had. The last scene of this story is not dramatic. It is not a landing or a rescue or a moment of crisis overcome. It is simply this a Saturday morning in Portland, sunlight streaming through kitchen windows, a father and daughter standing at a stove making pancakes together. The batter sizzles as it hits the griddle. Lily stands on a step stool, carefully measuring blueberries into a cup, her tongue poking out in concentration. Garrett watches her with the particular attention of a parent who has learned never to take ordinary moments for granted. Not too many, he says. Remember what happened last time. Lily grins. That was art, she says. Blueberry explosion art. Garrett laughs. I am not sure the ceiling agreed. They work together in easy rhythm, the familiarity of a routine practiced hundreds of times before. Flip, wait, flip again, stack on a plate, start the next batch. The letter from Patricia arrived yesterday, Garrett says. The foundation hit a new milestone. 5,000 families served. Lily looks up. That is a lot of families. It is, Garrett agrees. And it started because two people on an airplane decided to stop being strangers. Lily considers this. That is a good story, she says. It is, Garrett agrees. But you know what the best part is? What it is not finished yet. Lily smiles. Both things can be true, she says. Both things can be true, Garrett agrees. They finish the pancakes and carry them to the table. Syrup and butter and the mountain of blueberries that Lily insisted on adding despite Garrett's warnings. They eat together in the morning light, talking about nothing important. School, friends, the new book Lily is reading, the flight Garrett has scheduled for Tuesday. Ordinary things, precious things, the things that make a life. And if you were to look at them from outside, you would see nothing remarkable. Just a father and daughter sharing breakfast. Just a family starting their weekend. But you would be wrong, because underneath the ordinary there is always something more. The weight of what has been survived. The hope of what is yet to come. The quiet, persistent miracle of simply being alive. Garrett Cole knows this now. He learned it at 37,000 feet in a dying aircraft with 247 strangers depending on his hands. He learned it again every day, since in the letters that arrived, in the lives that continued, and the daughter who taught him that love is not about keeping people safe from everything. It is about giving them the freedom to be who they are meant to be. It is about standing up when the moment demands it. It is about coming home. Lily finishes her pancakes and pushes back from the table. Can we go to the airfield today? She asks. Garrett smiles. I thought you would never ask. They clean up together, then gather their things and head for the door. Outside, the sun is climbing higher, filling the world with light. Garrett pauses on the porch looking up at the sky. Somewhere up there, aircraft are crossing oceans and continents, carrying passengers who will never know how fragile their safety really is. Carrying pilots who pray they will never face what he faced. Carrying stories that might never be told. And somewhere down here on the ground, people are living the lives those flights make possible. Going to work, raising families, building futures, one ordinary day at a time. Garrett takes a breath of the clean morning air. Then he takes his daughter's hand, and they walk together toward whatever comes next.